I'm going to say two names. Watch what your brain does with each one. The first is Zeus, king of the gods, throws lightning, sits on a mountain. You've got a picture already, from a book, a film, a school lesson. The second name is Shango. Shango, a king who became a god, throws lightning, worshipped by millions of people on 3 continents, right now, today. And for most of the world, nothing. No picture. Maybe you've never heard the name at all. Here's the strange part. These 2 figures are almost the same idea, but one of them is filed under literature, taught in universities, turned into blockbusters, called part of the story of civilization. The other is filed under superstition, folklore, something a little embarrassing, a little frightening, best kept at arm's length. So here's the real question this video is about. It isn't why is Greek mythology better? It isn't. It's who decided which myths count as literature and which ones count as witchcraft? Because somebody did decide. And once you see how, you can't unsee it. Let's get into it. Let's start with the explanation almost everyone reaches for. Greek myths lasted because the Greeks wrote them down, and African myths faded because they were only ever spoken. It sounds reasonable. It's also, at its core, false. And the first crack in it is a big one. Homer, the blind poet, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the foundation of the whole Greek canon. Homer didn't write. Scholars are now broadly agreed that the Iliad and the Odyssey came out of a long oral tradition, performed, sung, and passed down by generations of singers for centuries before anyone set them in text. We even know the Greek word for what those performers were. A poet, in Homer's own lines, is an aioigis, a singer. Now hold that word next to a West African one, a griot, a hereditary keeper of a people's history, who carries genealogies, epics, and law in memory, and performs them aloud. A singer of the people's story. Homer, functionally, was a griot. The most celebrated poet in the European tradition did exactly what African oral historians have done for 1,000 years. The West canonized its griot and then told everyone else's that they weren't doing literature. And here's the second crack. The idea that Africans never wrote their myths down is simply not true. The Epic of Sundiata, the founding story of the Mali Empire, a genuine epic to rank beside the Odyssey, has been written down and published. Yoruba sacred knowledge fills a vast memorized corpus. Ethiopia has centuries of written religious literature. So the neat line, they wrote, we didn't, falls apart the moment you push on it. Which means the real question isn't who wrote and who didn't. It's why the same act, a people telling the story of where they came from, got called literature in one place and superstition in another. For that, we have to follow the power. So how did Greek myth climb onto the top shelf? 3 things mainly, and none of them is because it was better. First, survival. A body of Greek texts physically made it through the centuries, copied, recopied, preserved in libraries and monasteries. Stories that survive in writing can be taught, quoted, and built on. That's a real advantage. But notice it's an accident of preservation, not a measure of worth. Second, adoption. When European powers were building their own sense of themselves, they went looking for a noble ancestor, and they chose ancient Greece. From the Renaissance on, Greek and Roman myth became the furniture of an educated European mind. If you wanted to seem cultured, you learned your Zeus and your Apollo. Greek mythology got adopted as the childhood of civilization itself, Europe's civilization. That gave it enormous, self-renewing prestige. Third, institutions. Once the universities and the schools had decided Greek myth was foundational, they built whole departments around it. Classics, with degrees, syllabuses, translations, prizes. Generations of students learned it as serious knowledge. And that's really what literature means when you strip it down. It doesn't mean the best stories. It means the stories that powerful institutions decided to take seriously and teach. Greek myth didn't win on quality. It won on backing. Now the other shelf. Because the same centuries that were canonizing Zeus were doing something very deliberate to African belief. When European powers colonized the continent and missionaries followed, they met African spiritual systems that were rich, complex, and, crucially, in the way. These systems held communities together. They governed morality, marriage, land, justice, the seasons. To replace a people's religion and authority with your own, you first have to make theirs look illegitimate. So a language was built for exactly that. African deities became idols. African cosmology became superstition. African ritual became witchcraft. And African myth, the same kind of sacred story Homer told, became folklore. Or, in the polite academic version, ethnography. Feel the difference in those words. Greek stories were studied as literature and philosophy, evidence of a great mind. African stories were collected as ethnography, specimens of a primitive one. Same material, a god, a creation, a moral order, a hero. But one gets a professor and a printing press, and the other gets a footnote in a colonial official's report. That wasn't a judgment about the stories. It was a judgment about the people. And it was useful because if their myths were just darkness, then someone had to bring the light. The label did political work, and it worked so well that it soaked into Africans' own view of themselves. Generations grew up taught to be a little ashamed of the Orisha or the ancestors, to see their grandmother's stories as backward and someone else's myths as culture. The trickster spider Anansi, carried across the ocean by enslaved people and kept alive in the Caribbean and the American South, is one of the great survivors of world storytelling. But he's filed under children's folktales, while a Greek trickster god gets called an archetype. But this is a Griot channel, so here's the turn. Africans did not just accept the label, and two men in particular took a hammer to it. The first is a Ghanaian historian named Jibril Tamsir. In 1960, he did something quietly radical. He sat with a master griot, listened to the full Epic of Sundiata as it had been carried for 7 centuries, and published it as literature. Not as a specimen, as an epic, with an author-performer named on the page. His whole point was to prove that an oral tradition, collected with care, is real history and real literature, every bit as much as anything from Greece. He put the griot's name in the book. He refused the footnote. The second is a Malian sage named Amadou Hampâté Bâ. He spent his life arguing that African orality wasn't the absence of a library, it was a library. A living archive stored in trained human memory, cross-checked and handed down with discipline. And in 1960, standing at the United Nations, he said the line that has outlived every argument against him. He said, "In Africa, when an old man dies, a library burns." Think about what that sentence does. It takes the very thing colonialism sneered at, an old person telling stories, and says, that is a library. That is a civilization's memory, walking around in a body. Losing it is losing books. And once you accept that a griot is a library, that Homer was a griot, the whole hierarchy quietly collapses. There was never a shelf for real myths and a shelf for primitive ones. There was only ever one shelf and a long argument about who was allowed to stand on it. Let me leave you with a warning and then the point. The warning is this: when African knowledge does finally get attention, it often gets sensationalized instead of studied. You'll have seen the claim that the Dogon people of Mali somehow knew about an invisible companion star long before telescopes. Now, that specific story is genuinely disputed. It rests on one anthropologist's contested fieldwork, and it got wildly inflated by a later Ancient Aliens book. But notice the trap. African knowledge gets treated as either magic or nonsense, a mystery to gawp at or a superstition to dismiss. The one thing it rarely gets is the ordinary respect of just being taken seriously and studied the way Greek myth always was. Even the praise can be a way of not listening. So here's the point. The Orisha, Anansi, Sundiata, the Dogon cosmology, these aren't quaint. They're some of the deepest maps of meaning our species has ever made, about how the world began, how to live, what we owe each other. They didn't fail to become literature because they weren't good enough. They were pushed off the shelf on purpose by people who needed them to look small. Homer was a singer, so was the griot. The only real difference is which one the world was told to be proud of. And that, at last, is starting to change. This whole channel is part of that change, putting the stories back where they belong. There's another video on screen to carry straight on. I'll see you there.